Sometimes the people we leave behind become the very souls we would give everything to save. The monitor screamed so loudly it cut through the maternity ward like a siren in the middle of the night. Nurses rushed past polished white walls beneath cold fluorescent lights, while thunder rolled outside the hospital windows high above downtown Chicago. Rain hammered against the glass in silver waves, turning the city skyline into a blur of trembling lights. Inside delivery room 7, a young woman gripped the hospital bed so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Her breathing came in short, broken gasps. Sweat clung to strands of blonde hair stuck against her forehead. She was alone. No husband. No family. No hand to hold. Only the sound of machines and the crushing fear building inside her chest. "We're losing the baby's heartbeat," one nurse whispered urgently as another adjusted the monitors. The room suddenly moved faster. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. A surgeon was coming. The doors swung open hard enough to rattle the metal frame. Then everything stopped. Dr. Ethan Hayes froze the moment he saw her face. For one impossible second, the billionaire surgeon who appeared on magazine covers and business networks every month looked like a man who had forgotten how to breathe. Emily Carter stared back at him through tears and pain, disbelief flooding her exhausted eyes. 5 years disappeared in a heartbeat. Ethan had spent years convincing himself he no longer thought about her. But now she was here, on his operating table, carrying a child. The same woman who had once sat beside him in crowded medical school lectures, eating vending machine pretzels at 2 in the morning. The same woman who had kissed him under a snowstorm outside St. Mary's campus library and whispered that one day they would build a life together. Ethan's chest tightened painfully beneath his navy surgical coat. Emily looked smaller now. Fragile, worn down by years. Life clearly had not treated kindly. Her hospital gown hung loosely against trembling shoulders, and the faded canvas backpack sitting beside the bed looked heartbreakingly out of place inside one of the most expensive private hospitals in America. A nurse stepped closer nervously. "Doctor, fetal heart rate is dropping again." Ethan snapped back into motion immediately. "Prep the OR. Now." His voice was calm, sharp, commanding. The voice that built a billion-dollar medical empire. But his eyes never left Emily's face. She swallowed hard before finally speaking his name for the first time in half a decade. "Ethan." The sound nearly shattered him. Outside the room, the hospital buzzed with wealth and power. Marble floors gleamed beneath chandeliers. Private donors' names covered entire wings of the building. Ethan Hayes owned nearly 40% of the hospital network himself. Reporters called him the miracle surgeon billionaire. Patients flew across the country just to have him operate on them. But none of that mattered now, because the woman he had once loved more than his own future was lying terrified in front of him, fighting to bring a child into the world alone. Ethan carefully pulled on a pair of gloves while trying to ignore the storm rising inside his chest. Then his eyes drifted toward Emily's chart resting near the monitor. His gaze stopped instantly on the date listed beneath the pregnancy timeline. His blood ran cold. The numbers lined up perfectly with the night she vanished from his life forever. And suddenly, a terrifying possibility entered his mind. The storm outside deepened as lightning flashed across the Chicago skyline, illuminating the towering glass walls of St. Gabriel Medical Center like cracks of silver fire. Inside the operating floor, the warmth of polished marble and soft golden lighting could not hide the tension spreading through the maternity wing. Nurses moved quickly between rooms while distant monitor alarms blended with the low rumble of thunder. But inside delivery room 7, time itself seemed trapped between the past and the present. Ethan Hayes stood motionless for half a second longer than any surgeon should. His gloved hand tightened slightly at his side, while his mind fought to process what his eyes were seeing. Emily Carter. After 5 years, she was here. Not in some memory buried beneath billion-dollar meetings and magazine interviews. Not in the old photographs hidden in the bottom drawer of his penthouse office desk. Real, pale, frightened, breathing hard beneath harsh hospital lights. Ethan forced himself back into focus as another contraction hit her. Emily turned her face slightly away, trying to hide the pain, but he still saw it. She had always tried to carry suffering quietly. Even back in medical school, when she worked double shifts at a diner near campus and still showed up every morning with coffee for both of them. Ethan remembered those mornings too clearly. The smell of burnt espresso, Snow piled outside the windows. Emily laughing softly while studying anatomy flashcards with yellow highlighter stains on her fingers. Back then, they had nothing except impossible dreams and each other. Doctor, a nurse asked carefully. Ethan blinked. Get anesthesia ready and notify neonatal intensive care immediately. His voice remained steady, but inside, old wounds were reopening one by one. Emily looked toward him again, her blue eyes glassy with exhaustion. There was fear there, but something else too. Shame. As if she hated being seen by him like this. Ethan noticed the small details instantly. The worn sneakers beneath the hospital bed. The faded backpack with a broken zipper. The cheap plastic bracelet around her wrist from county intake before transfer. She had arrived alone through emergency services, meaning she probably delayed care because she could not afford treatment sooner. The realization twisted painfully inside his chest. Meanwhile, just 30 floors above them, Ethan's name glowed across the side of the hospital tower in giant silver letters. Hayes Women's and Children's Center. Reporters called him the man who revolutionized maternal health care in America. Investors praised his compassion. Politicians shook his hand for cameras. Yet somehow the one woman he once promised to protect had suffered alone under his own roof, without him ever knowing. Emily suddenly grabbed the side rails as another wave of pain hit. The monitor numbers dipped sharply. A nurse frowned. Heart rate is unstable again. Ethan stepped closer immediately. Emily, listen to me. His voice softened for the first time. I need you to stay calm. She gave a weak laugh that sounded heartbreakingly empty. You always said that before exams too. For a brief second, silence passed between them. Not awkward silence. Familiar silence. The kind shared only by two people who once knew each other better than anyone else alive. Ethan felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. He had spent years building an empire large enough to distract himself from losing her. But standing here now, none of it mattered. Not the private jets. Not the billion-dollar mergers. Not the awards displayed in his office. Because Emily still looked at him the exact same way she had the night she disappeared from his life. Like she wanted to trust him, but no longer knew how. Then Ethan's eyes drifted once more toward the pregnancy chart, clipped beside the monitor. 39 weeks. The conception timeline matched perfectly. His pulse slowed into cold disbelief. And for the first time since entering the room, Ethan Hayes became afraid of the answer forming inside his own mind. Rainwater streamed down the towering glass windows of St. Gabriel Medical Center, while the city below dissolved into a sea of blurred headlights and flashing reflections. Somewhere far beneath the storm, Chicago continued moving through another ordinary night. But on the 32nd floor of the hospital Ethan Hayes built with his own name and fortune, nothing felt ordinary anymore. The delivery room had become painfully quiet except for the steady rhythm of machines and Emily's uneven breathing. Ethan stood beside her bed reviewing scans on a digital monitor, but the numbers barely registered in his mind. His thoughts kept dragging him backward through time to memories he had spent years trying to bury beneath work and success. 5 years ago, Emily Carter had been the brightest person in every room she entered. Not loud, not arrogant, just quietly brilliant. She had been the kind of woman who stayed late tutoring struggling classmates even after finishing the top exam scores herself. Ethan still remembered how she used to sit cross-legged on the library floor with medical textbooks spread around her while snow fell outside campus windows. She would underline entire paragraphs in blue ink while humming softly under her breath, completely unaware he was watching her instead of studying. Back then, Ethan Hayes was not a billionaire. He was simply a young man obsessed with becoming a surgeon worthy of respect. His father, Richard Hayes, controlled one of the largest healthcare corporations in America and expected perfection from his only son. Richard spoke in boardrooms, contracts, and numbers. Emily spoke in kindness. Ethan fell in love with her slowly at first, then all at once. He remembered cheap takeout dinners after midnight classes, shared coffee from paper cups because they could not afford to, long walks across frozen sidewalks while Emily talked about wanting to open free clinics someday for women who could not afford healthcare. Nobody should suffer just because they are poor, she once told him quietly while standing beneath a flickering streetlight outside their apartment building. Ethan had kissed her right there in the snow. He had honestly believed they would spend forever together. But forever lasted exactly 1 week after graduation. Ethan's expression darkened slightly as the memories sharpened. He remembered returning to their apartment one night to find Emily gone. No goodbye, no explanation. Her clothes missing from the closet. Her books gone from the shelves. Only silence remained. Then came the message she sent 2 days later. Short, cold, cruel enough to destroy him. She wrote that she was tired of struggling and had accepted an opportunity elsewhere with someone who could offer her a better life. Ethan read the message over and over until the words lost meaning. Richard Hayes had stepped into the wreckage immediately afterward with polished sympathy and quiet poison. People like Emily always leave when money enters the picture, his father told him calmly. You were simply too emotional to see it. Ethan believed him, or at least he forced himself to. It was easier than admitting the heartbreak nearly destroyed him. So Ethan buried himself in work. Residency became obsession. Obsession became empire. Years passed. Billions were made. His face appeared on television beside headlines calling him America's miracle surgeon. Yet some nights he still reached instinctively toward the empty side of his bed before remembering nobody was there. Now here she was again, pale beneath hospital lights, fighting through labor alone. Ethan slowly looked toward Emily while she rested weakly against the pillow, exhaustion clouding her eyes. Then his gaze drifted lower toward the hospital bracelet wrapped around her wrist. No emergency contact listed. No spouse. No family member. Just Emily Carter. Alone. A sudden pain tightened in his chest harder than before. Because deep down, beneath all the confusion and old anger, one terrible question refused to leave him now. If the child was his, why had she never told him? The wind outside slammed rain against the hospital windows hard enough to sound like distant waves crashing against stone. Midnight had swallowed the city completely now. Helicopter lights blinked through dark clouds above downtown Chicago while inside St. Gabriel Medical Center, the maternity floor glowed with sterile warmth and quiet urgency. Nurses moved quickly past glass doors carrying trays of instruments and stacks of clean linens. But inside Delivery Room 7, the air felt heavier with every passing minute. Emily's contractions were coming faster now. Each one forced sharp breaths from her chest while the monitor beside her flickered with unstable numbers. Ethan stood close enough to hear every strained inhale, yet somehow the distance between them still felt enormous. 5 years of silence sat inside the room with them like another living thing. Emily kept her eyes toward the ceiling most of the time, avoiding his gaze whenever she could. Ethan recognized that habit immediately. She only did that when she was trying not to cry. A nurse adjusted the fetal monitor again before looking toward Ethan with concern. The baby is under stress. Ethan nodded once. Come outside. Chaos underneath. That was what made him famous in operating rooms across the country. But tonight felt different. Tonight his hands did not feel steady. Because this was not another patient. This was Emily, the woman whose absence had quietly haunted every success he achieved afterward. Ethan stepped toward the sink to wash his hands again, even though they were already clean. The cool water ran over his fingers while memories kept returning whether he wanted them or not. You should hate me, Emily suddenly whispered from the bed. Ethan looked up slowly. Her voice sounded fragile beneath the hum of fluorescent lights. I tried to, he answered honestly. Silence followed. Not angry silence. Sad silence. The kind carried by people who once loved each other deeply enough to damage one another forever. Emily swallowed hard before turning her face toward the rain streaking down the windows. I did not leave because I stopped loving you. Ethan's chest tightened instantly. The words hit harder than he expected. He stared at her carefully. Then why did you disappear? Emily closed her eyes for a moment as another contraction twisted through her body. She gripped the bed rail and breathed through it before speaking again. Because your father came to see me. Ethan froze. Thunder rolled outside somewhere far above the city. Emily's eyes glistened under the dim lights as she continued softly. 2 days before graduation, he invited me to his office downtown. I thought he wanted to congratulate us. Her voice trembled slightly now. Instead, he told me I would destroy your future. Ethan felt cold spread through his stomach. Richard Hayes had always controlled every room he entered with polished calm and expensive smiles. Ethan suddenly remembered those same weeks differently now. The strange tension in his father's voice whenever Emily's name came up. The sudden business trips. The constant pressure to leave Chicago immediately after graduation. Emily looked painfully exhausted as she continued. He told me your career would collapse if investors found out you planned to marry a waitress with student debt. Ethan stared at her speechless. Emily. He offered me money to disappear. Ethan's breath caught. I said no. Tears slid silently down Emily's cheeks now. Then he told me if I stayed, he would make sure you lost everything before your career even started. Ethan felt something inside him crack quietly apart. For years he had carried anger toward her. Resentment. Betrayal. But now another truth was rising through the wreckage instead. Emily had not abandoned him. She sacrificed herself for him. The monitor beside her suddenly beeped sharply again. A nurse stepped forward quickly. Doctor, the baby's heart rate just dropped again. Ethan turned immediately toward the screen. The numbers were falling too fast now. His surgeon instincts took over instantly, but beneath the training and control, panic was beginning to spread through him for the first time that night. Then Emily looked at him with tears still shining in her eyes and whispered the words that changed everything forever. Ethan, she is your daughter. For one suspended moment, the entire room seemed to lose sound. The storm outside faded. The monitor alarms blurred into distant static. Ethan Hayes stood frozen beside the hospital bed, while Emily's words echoed through him harder than any thunder shaking the city outside. She is your daughter. Ethan stared at her as if the world beneath his feet had shifted without warning. His mind tried to reject it at first, not because he doubted her, but because the truth hurt too much to absorb all at once. 5 years. 5 birthdays he never celebrated. 5 years of first words, first steps, scraped knees, bedtime stories, nightmares, and laughter stolen from him before he even knew she existed. Ethan slowly lowered himself into the chair beside the bed, his gloved hand trembling for the first time in his surgical career. Emily looked away immediately, ashamed of the tears sliding down her face. I wanted to tell you, she whispered weakly. I wrote letters so many times. Ethan swallowed hard. Then why did you not? Emily gave a broken laugh that carried no happiness at all. Because every time I saw your face on television, you looked successful. Happy. Your father convinced me that disappearing was the best thing I could do for you. Ethan closed his eyes briefly as anger rose inside him like fire under steel. Not toward Emily. Toward himself. Toward the years he spent believing she abandoned him while she struggled alone carrying their child. He suddenly imagined her sitting awake at night in some tiny apartment, pregnant and terrified, with nobody beside her. The thought hollowed him out from the inside. Another contraction hit hard enough to steal Emily's breath. The monitor beside her dipped sharply again. Nurses moved quickly around the room now. One checked the intravenous line, while another studied the fetal heart tracing with growing concern. Doctor, variability is worsening. Ethan stood instantly. Emotion vanished behind surgical focus. Get the operating room ready now. We are moving. The room erupted into motion. Wheels unlocked beneath the bed. Nurses pushed equipment through the doors while overhead lights streaked across the polished hallway ceilings. Rain battered the massive hospital windows as Emily was rushed toward surgery. Ethan walked beside her the entire way. Not billionaire founder. Not celebrity surgeon. Just a frightened man trying not to lose the family he never knew he still had. Emily reached weakly toward him during another wave of pain. Ethan grabbed her hand immediately without hesitation. Her fingers were cold against his palm. Please, she whispered through trembling breaths. Save her. Ethan's jaw tightened. I am going to save both of you. She looked at him, then with exhausted eyes filled with fear and love and years of unspoken sorrow. You cannot promise that. Ethan leaned closer as the bed rolled beneath fluorescent lights reflecting against the marble floors of his own hospital empire. Yes, he said quietly. I can. The operating room doors burst open. Inside, bright surgical lights flooded stainless steel surfaces with cold white glare. Machines beeped steadily while nurses prepared instruments with practiced speed. Outside the windows beyond the operating floor, lightning flashed across the Chicago skyline again, illuminating the storm clouds rolling above the city. Ethan pulled on a fresh surgical gown while another doctor stepped beside him reviewing the chart. Complications are increasing fast, the physician warned quietly. If things turn critical, we may have to prioritize the mother. Ethan's eyes snapped toward him instantly. No, the doctor hesitated. Ethan, no. he repeated, sharper this time. You saved both. Emily lay beneath the operating lights, barely conscious now, her blonde hair damp against the pillow while the monitor near her bed continued its unstable rhythm. Ethan moved toward her slowly, then stopped cold halfway across the room. Hanging against Emily's neck was a tiny silver chain, and attached to it was the old engagement ring he gave her the night he planned their future together beneath a snowy Chicago sky. She had kept it all these years. Ethan's breath caught painfully in his chest as realization crashed into him harder than anything before. Emily never stopped loving him either. The operating room lights burned bright against polished steel while thunder rolled above the hospital tower like distant cannon fire. Rain streaked across the massive windows surrounding St. Gabriel Medical Center, turning the Chicago skyline into blurred rivers of gold and silver. Inside the surgical suite, every sound felt sharper now. The steady hiss of oxygen, the rapid beeping of monitors, the rustle of gloves and sterile gowns. Fear lived inside those sounds tonight. Emily lay beneath the surgical lights, barely conscious, her face pale with exhaustion while nurses moved quickly around her. The silver necklace still rested against her collarbone, the small engagement ring glinting softly every time lightning flashed outside. Ethan could not stop seeing it. 5 years. She carried that ring for 5 years while he spent those same years believing she stopped loving him. The realization hollowed him out from the inside. Doctor, blood pressure is dropping, one nurse warned. Ethan immediately forced emotion aside. There would be time later to break apart. Right now he had 2 lives depending on him. He stepped toward the operating table and looked down at Emily carefully. Her eyes fluttered open weakly. Ethan, she whispered. He leaned closer instantly. I am here. A tear slipped quietly from the corner of her eye. If something happens, Ethan shook his head before she could finish. No, his voice came low and firm. Nothing is happening to you. Emily managed the faintest smile. Through her exhaustion, you still sound stubborn. Ethan almost smiled back, but the monitor beside her suddenly let out a sharper warning tone. The baby's heartbeat dropped again. Fast this time. The room changed instantly. Nurses exchanged tense glances. Another physician stepped beside Ethan while reviewing the monitor. We may not have much time. Ethan's jaw tightened. Then we move now. The storm outside exploded with another burst of thunder as the procedure began. Ethan's hands moved with precise calm developed through thousands of surgeries, but tonight every second felt personal. This was no longer medicine. This was redemption. The woman beneath those lights had suffered alone while he built skyscrapers with his name on them. And the little girl fighting for life had never once heard him say the words father or daughter. Ethan felt sick realizing how much had already been stolen from them. A nurse wiped sweat from Emily's forehead while another adjusted equipment nearby. The room remained tense but controlled until suddenly every light inside the operating suite flickered once. Then twice. A low mechanical hum echoed through the ceiling. One nurse looked upward nervously. Backup generators are activating, she said quickly. For one terrifying second the room dimmed into shadow before emergency lighting flooded the suite in deep amber tones. The storm had damaged part of the power grid outside. The city beyond the windows vanished into darkness except for distant emergency lights far below. Inside the operating room, the golden backup lighting transformed everything. Ethan looked less like a billionaire surgeon now and more like a man standing inside the hardest moment of his life. The baby's heartbeat weakened again. Another doctor looked toward Ethan grimly. We are losing her. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. No, he said sharply. Not tonight. He focused harder than he ever had before. Every movement became exact, controlled, desperate. The room faded away around him until nothing existed except Emily and their daughter. Minutes stretched endlessly beneath the storm outside. Then suddenly a sharp cry pierced through the operating room. Small, fragile, alive. Every person in the room froze for half a second before relief flooded the air like sunlight breaking through clouds. Ethan stopped breathing entirely as a nurse carefully lifted the newborn infant wrapped in soft white blankets. Tiny fingers curled against the fabric, a full head of pale blonde hair, and eyes that opened for one impossible moment revealing the exact same deep blue color as Emily's. Ethan stared at the child speechless while something inside him shattered completely apart. A nurse stepped closer carefully. Doctor. But Ethan was already reaching forward with trembling hands. When they placed the baby into his arms, the billionaire surgeon who commanded billion-dollar companies and operating rooms across America suddenly looked like the most terrified man in the world. The tiny cry echoed through the operating room like the sound of hope itself. Outside, the storm still raged above Chicago, rain crashing against the hospital tower in endless silver sheets. But inside St. Gabriel Medical Center, something had changed completely. Relief swept across the surgical team in quiet waves while nurses moved carefully beneath the amber emergency lights. For the first time that night, nobody looked afraid. Ethan Hayes stood motionless near the operating table, holding the newborn child against his chest, as though letting go might somehow cause the entire moment to disappear. The baby was impossibly small, wrapped inside soft white blankets. Yet to Ethan, she felt heavier than every billion-dollar deal, every award, every empire he had spent years building without realizing what was truly missing from his life. Her tiny fingers curled weakly around the edge of his glove. Ethan stared down at her in complete silence. He had delivered thousands of babies during his career. He had witnessed first breaths, first cries, first moments of life more times than he could count. But this was different. This little girl carried his eyes. Emily's smile. His entire heart. A nurse beside him smiled softly. She is beautiful. Ethan swallowed hard, unable to speak for several seconds. His eyes had started to burn unexpectedly. Finally, he managed to whisper, "Yeah, she really is." Behind him, another physician quietly finished monitoring Emily while the operating room slowly settled into exhausted calm. Emily remained weak from the difficult delivery, but her breathing had steadied now. Her eyes fluttered open slowly beneath the bright surgical lights. "The baby," she whispered immediately. Ethan turned toward her at once. The moment Emily saw the child safely in his arms, tears slipped silently down her cheeks. Not tears of fear this time. Relief. Ethan carefully stepped beside her bed and lowered the newborn gently so Emily could see her daughter clearly for the first time. The tiny infant blinked beneath the warm light, peaceful now after entering a world filled with storms and unfinished love stories. Emily's trembling fingers brushed softly against the baby's cheek. "Hi, sweetheart," she whispered brokenly. Ethan watched them together and felt something inside him completely unravel. 5 years ago, he lost the woman he loved because he trusted the wrong people. Tonight, he nearly lost both her and their daughter before learning the truth. The weight of those stolen years settled heavily across his chest. "I am sorry," he said quietly. Emily looked toward him weakly. Ethan's voice cracked for the first time in years. "I should have found you." Emily closed her eyes briefly as tears continued slipping across her face. "You could not have known." But Ethan shook his head immediately. "I should have known you better than that." Silence filled the room again, softer this time. No anger remained there now, only grief for the years they lost. Outside the operating room windows, the city slowly began returning to life as portions of the skyline flickered back on one building at a time. The storm was finally beginning to weaken. A nurse nearby checked the newborn bracelet before pausing awkwardly. "Dr. Hayes," Ethan looked up. "We still need the baby's paperwork completed." Ethan nodded absently until the nurse added gently, "The father's name section is blank." The words hit the room quietly but heavily. Emily looked away immediately, ashamed without reason. Ethan stared at the clipboard for one long second, before slowly handing the baby back toward Emily. Then he reached for the paperwork himself. The billionaire surgeon whose signature appeared on hospital towers, research grants, and billion-dollar contracts calmly picked up the pen. Without hesitation, Ethan wrote his name onto the line beside the word father. Firm, certain, permanent. Emily looked at him in stunned silence while Ethan kept his eyes on the form. "Nobody," he said softly, "is growing up without knowing they are loved ever again." Morning arrived slowly over Chicago like light returning after a long punishment. The storm clouds had finally broken apart, leaving pale gold sunlight spilling across the glass towers downtown and reflecting against the windows of St. Gabriel Medical Center. Inside the recovery suite on the hospital's top floor, the world felt quieter now. Softer. Machines hummed gently in the background while the newborn slept peacefully inside a clear bassinet beside the window. Emily rested against crisp white pillows wrapped in a light gray blanket, exhaustion still visible beneath her eyes, but no longer mixed with fear. For the first time in years, she was not alone. Ethan stood near the window wearing a simple black sweater instead of the expensive tailored suits the world usually saw him in. His tie was gone. His sleeves remained rolled up from the surgery hours earlier. Outside the room, executives, investors, and reporters had already begun flooding the hospital with messages after learning the famous billionaire surgeon canceled every meeting scheduled for the next 48 hours. Nobody understood why. Ethan did not care. His attention never drifted far from the tiny sleeping child beside Emily's bed. Every few minutes, he caught himself staring at her in disbelief. The small rise and fall of her breathing. The way her fingers curled while she slept. The tiny sounds she made beneath the blanket. It all felt miraculous to him. A soft knock interrupted the silence. One of Ethan's senior administrators stepped cautiously into the room, carrying a digital tablet. "Dr. Hayes, the board is asking if you still plan to attend the New York Acquisition Conference this afternoon." Ethan barely looked up. "No." The woman hesitated nervously. "Sir, the merger involves nearly $4 billion. Ethan finally turned toward her calmly. "Then they can survive one day without me." The administrator nodded awkwardly and left. Emily watched the exchange quietly from the bed. "You used to never miss meetings," she said softly. Ethan walked toward the bassinet and looked down at his daughter again before answering. "I already missed enough." Emily lowered her eyes immediately, emotion tightening in her throat. Sunlight illuminated the silver necklace still resting against her collarbone, while the old engagement ring glimmered faintly against the fabric of her hospital gown. Ethan noticed it again. This time he stepped closer. "Why did you keep wearing it?" Emily smiled sadly without looking up. "Because letting go of you was the hardest thing I ever did." Ethan's expression cracked with quiet pain. For years he imagined Emily moved on easily while he buried himself in work, trying to outrun heartbreak. Now he realized she carried the same wound all along. Before he could answer, another knock sounded at the door. This time 2 hospital attorneys entered carefully alongside several executives from the Hayes Foundation. They looked confused seeing Ethan sitting beside a hospital bed instead of inside a boardroom. Ethan stood slowly and took the folder one of them offered. "I need these filed immediately," he said calmly. One executive adjusted his glasses while reading the documents. Then his eyes widened in shock. "Sir, this transfers 30% of your personal shares into a new nonprofit maternal care foundation." Ethan nodded once. "Effective today." The room fell silent. Even Emily stared at him in disbelief. "Ethan," he looked toward her gently. "No woman should ever sit in an emergency room terrified because she cannot afford care for her child." The executive continued scanning the paperwork. "The foundation name is already listed." Ethan's voice softened. "Emily Carter Foundation." Emily covered her mouth instantly as tears filled her eyes again. She shook her head weakly. "You do not have to do this." Ethan stepped beside her bed and looked directly at her for the first time without walls between them. "Yes," he said quietly. "I do." Then he carefully reached down and lifted his sleeping daughter into his arms once more. Morning sunlight wrapped around all 3 of them while the city slowly awakened below. And for the first time in 5 years, Ethan Hayes no longer looked like the richest man in the room. He looked like a father finally finding his way home. 6 months later, winter returned to Chicago carrying soft snow across the city streets and wrapping the skyline in silver light. The storm that nearly destroyed 3 lives had long passed, but its echoes still lived quietly inside the hearts of everyone touched by that night. Outside St. Gabriel Medical Center, reporters gathered beneath glowing cameras while people lined the sidewalks despite the cold December wind. Some held flowers. Some carried infants bundled in blankets. Others simply came because they had heard the story spreading across the country about the billionaire surgeon who walked away from boardrooms to become the father he never knew he was meant to be. High above the crowded streets, sunlight spilled through the massive windows of the newly opened Emily Carter Foundation for Mothers and Children. The floor no longer felt like a luxury hospital wing reserved only for the wealthy. Warm colors replaced cold marble. Children's drawings lined the walls. Volunteers carried hot meals through family waiting rooms where no mother was ever asked whether she could afford treatment before receiving help. The foundation had already paid for hundreds of emergency deliveries, prenatal visits, medications, and safe housing for struggling mothers across Illinois. Nurses whispered about it with pride. Patients cried when they learned their bills had been erased anonymously overnight. But the most surprising change was Ethan Hayes himself. The man once known for impossible schedules and billion-dollar negotiations had quietly disappeared from magazine covers almost entirely. Investors complained he spent too much time away from meetings now. Shareholders questioned why he personally visited pediatric recovery rooms every morning before work. Ethan did not care anymore. Some mornings he arrived at the hospital carrying diaper bags over one shoulder while balancing coffee cups in his free hand. Nurses smiled every time they saw him pacing the hallways late at night with his daughter sleeping peacefully against his chest. The billionaire surgeon who once built skyscrapers now spent hours learning lullabies and how to warm baby bottles correctly. And somehow, he had never looked happier. Inside one of the foundation offices overlooking the snowy city, Emily sat beside the window holding her daughter close while soft piano music played through hidden ceiling speakers. Her life still was not perfect. Healing never happened all at once. Some scars remained quiet but permanent. Yet for the first time in years, she no longer woke up terrified about tomorrow. Ethan entered the room carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate and paused the moment he saw them together beneath the golden afternoon light. Emily looked up and smiled softly. The same smile that once made a broke medical student believe he could survive anything. Ethan crossed the room slowly before sitting beside her on the couch. Their daughter slept peacefully between them, wrapped in a pale cream blanket, while snow drifted outside the glass. For a while, neither of them spoke. They simply listened to the quiet breathing of the child, who somehow brought them back to each other after years of loss and misunderstanding. Finally, Emily looked toward him gently. "Do you ever wish things happened differently?" Ethan stared out at the falling snow covering the city below before answering. "Every day." Emily lowered her eyes sadly, but Ethan reached for her hand immediately. "But if all that pain is what led me here," he glanced toward their sleeping daughter, "then I would survive it again." Emily's eyes filled with tears as Ethan carefully kissed her forehead, not with desperation this time, but with the calm tenderness of someone who finally understood what truly mattered. Outside, the city lights slowly flickered alive, one building at a time, as evening settled over Chicago. And somewhere beneath the snow and noise and endless movement of the world, 3 hearts once separated by fear had finally found their way back home to each other. Because in the end, the strongest people are not the ones who build empires. They are the ones who choose love after life gives them every reason not to.